This is Talkback 721-1290 or 1-800-568-5309.
This is Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 98.3 FM. KGVO, Missoula's news and weather station.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Monday, November 18th edition of Talkback. Nick is off today, so it's just you and me, and we have Doctors Mehrdad Kia and Michael Mayer. Michael's here in the studio. Mehrdad's on the phone for the KGVO Book Club. But I got to tell you first, the Talkback this morning is brought to you by 123 Seamless Gutters. They're family-owned and operated, doing gutter installations, repairs, and more. The number, 240-2669, 406, obviously, protecting the foundation of your future. Harrington Surgical Supply, where you can feel confident in their discreet and knowledgeable guidance on a multitude of products and medical supplies. West Storage, their number 406-510-0590. They're making room for you. They're located out at the Y. And by Phillips Janitorial, offering both residential and commercial cleaning, your home and your business. No job too big or small for Phillips. 406-260-6617.
The views and opinions expressed on Talkback are not those of the staff, management, or advertisers.
Okay, bookworms, here we are. It is a thrill once again to have with us Dr. Mehrdad Kia on the phone at the University of Montana History Department and Department of History, and Dr. Michael Mayer, Professor Emeritus at U of M. And so we are here. This has become, as I mentioned before, a very popular program in that I can't remember the last time a good old a radio station just had a KGVO book club, a for-profit radio station.
Yeah, right.
So here we are. And so tell us about the book and the author, gentlemen. Please go ahead.
The author is Dwight Chapin. The book's called The President's Man, which is a play on Woodward and Bernstein, All the President's Men, because Dwight Chapin was one of Nixon's men, and it's his memoir of his long association with Richard Nixon that began with Nixon's campaign in 1962 for governor of California and extended until Chapin resigned over, I guess you would say, Watergate related, as he maintains it with a certain degree of accuracy. He had nothing to do with Watergate. It was his hiring of Don Segretti to do dirty tricks that was part of that whole thing, but he had nothing to do with the Watergate break-in. But he was involved with marginally with the dirty trick.
He had a peripheral type thing, right? Yeah.
He did go to prison for it.
But I was going to say he went to prison, and he did have an inside view of what was going on, actually working at the White House.
Yeah, and that and Mehrdad and I were talking the other day about it, and that inside view is both the most valuable thing. Because it really, and there are insights into Nixon and some of the other characters you won't find many other places, and it's also limiting because often the broader historical context is not part of his story because his story is about him. It's his story.
Right. Dr. Kia.
Well, I think I have to say this is an exceptional book in many ways because it's written by an insider. He was deputy assistant to the President of the United States, but he had a long history with President Nixon, but also he was himself sort of a protege of Bob Haldeman. And, so he knew the machine, the sort of support network which made President Nixon, win 2 elections. But he worked also with Henry Kissinger in opening China. So the book is very valuable in the sense that it gives you an insider look, not a comprehensive history of Nixon's presidency, but a sense of what was taking place. And what is very important, it came on the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's, I would say, epic trips to China and Russia. I think a lot of people tend to forget that Nixon was basically a history-making president in this sense that, he basically used conflict between Communist China and Communist Soviet Union to actually open a new relationship with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in China, and basically created a rift, more or less, which already existed, but deepened that rift between Beijing and Moscow. And in this sense, he was a master statesman. I think he was one of the last presidents who read and who actually articulated policies based on his deep knowledge of issues. We tend to forget also about Nixon that he was the vice president of one of the greatest presidents the United States has ever had, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Right.
And he knew the world. He knew the world in which he operated. He was very well educated in terms of foreign policy issues. So it's more than just you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore kind of 1962 campaign, but much more.
We're up against our first break, and phone lines are open, by the way. I just want to remind you, Nick Christensen is taking Mondays off for a while to burn up some PTO, as we call it. And so I will be handling the phones as well as doing the narration here. So if you have a question or a comment, give us a call. We'll get you on just as quickly as we can. The book is called The President's Man. It's written by Dwight Chapin, someone, of course, who, as we've heard already, who became very well known, not necessarily popular, but well known during the Watergate era. If you have a question or comment, maybe you lived through it like I did, give us a call, 721-1290. We're going to come right back with more right after this.
Call 123 Seamless.
Dennis Bragg with the updated weather. Snow or mixed rain and snow showers likely today, although accumulations will continue to be minimal in all but the higher passes and valleys. Still be prepared for wintry driving, especially tonight, as lows will drop down into the upper teens. Tuesday brings a little sun, not much warmer, reaching highs only in the mid-30s for the afternoon. Another chance of snow for the higher valleys and passes Wednesday, and we're watching for possible rain, a little warmer weather the end of the week with a chance of snow next weekend.
Welcome back to Talk Back. 721-1290 is our number. It's the KGVO Book Club. Peter Christian here. Nick Christensen is off today. Joining us on the phone, Dr. Mehrdad Kia from the University of Montana Department of History. Dr. Michael Mayer here in the studio, Professor Emeritus. And we're talking about the book called The President's Man, written by Dwight Chapin. And we already have a caller, so should we get right on it? All right, let's do that. All right. Good morning, Helena. You're on with our guests on the KGVO Book Club. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call. I was wondering if the book discusses much about President Nixon's efforts to end the Vietnam War and his.
Yes, it does. There's a long segment on that in the book, and he takes the position very much from within the administration that the Nixon administration made vigorous efforts to end the war from the minute they got in, as Nixon had promised to do during the campaign, and that they were thwarted by not just the North Vietnamese, but also by the support of the Soviets and Chinese for the North Vietnamese, but also by demonstrators in the United States who by the calculations of the people in the administration, encouraged the North Vietnamese to hold out for their positions because there was the possibility that Nixon would lose the next election, or that in some way that his political support would not bear maintaining a really strong bargaining position, which is a short version of a long section. But he goes through a lot of that, and it's interesting. It's interesting to see. He's not completely unsympathetic to the protesters, but he regards them as misguided. I think the people who engage in violence, he has a lot less sympathy for.
Yeah, I think Nixon in some ways comes out as very clear-eyed, in terms of what this war in Vietnam is. And as Mike mentioned, I think the fact that North Vietnam was supported by both Soviet Union and China, in fact, was a neighbor that could supply North Vietnam on land and provide, an unlimited flow of arms and spare parts to the North Vietnamese army basically made this almost impossible to win, especially when you have also kind of a protege or a fifth column in South Vietnam in the form of the Viet Cong, and a very weak government in Saigon in South Vietnam. So all of this, I think, combined clearly convinced the Nixon administration that this was a very difficult war to win. And I think this Mike can actually elaborate on this, but the Tet Offensive and the way it was covered by the media in this country as if it was a major defeat and so on and so forth just added to the sense that the war had to end. But it's very interesting that when you look at the book, when you read it, you realize the difference in the vision. A lot of people, especially on the left, were basically labeling Nixon as a war criminal, somebody who loves to continue the war and the bombings and so on and so forth. What you get in the book from an insider is actually there were serious attempts to end the war as quickly as possible.
Now, I will say, in my reading and, of course, movie watching, not that movies are always tremendously accurate, but that President Kennedy was hesitant to get more involved in Vietnam and did not want to, and it was the military powers that be that said, no, this is something we need to do.
No, it's quite the contrary.
It is, okay, all right.
In fact, that's what Oliver Stone said.
Okay.
Oliver Stone knows how to make movies, but he's a pathological liar.
Good to know.
If you look at the opening scene of that movie, JFK, there's a voiceover of Kennedy saying, but ultimately it's their fight, and they'll have to win it, referring to the South Vietnamese.
Right.
And it cuts and moves on. He did say that. He said that in an interview with Walter Cronkite in 1962. And the next sentence was, and some people say, therefore, we should get out. But I'm telling you, as long as I'm president, we're not going anyplace.
Okay.
And Kennedy escalated right up to the time of his death. American forces were already engaging in combat, not in massive numbers, but the Green Berets were there and engaged in combat at times. American forces had begun to take casualties, and it escalated under Lyndon Johnson. So that's a common misconception, partly because of Oliver Stone.
Yeah, and that's what I get for getting my history from movies rather than from actual history. Yeah, we're up against another break. By the way, all of our phone lines are open. We appreciate Helena's call, but we'd love to have you be a part of this conversation. The book's called The President's Man, and it's written by Dwight Chapin, who was in the Nixon White House and has written a very interesting book here. And when was it first released?
In 2022. It's a recent book, and as Mehrdad suggested, it's a good read. It's very readable. It reads quickly, and a lot of storytelling, and so it makes it interesting.
You bet. We're going to come right back. We'd love to have your calls. Our phone lines are open at 721-1290, 1-800-568-5309, and we will get back with more of the KGVO Book Club after this quick timeout. We're talking American history here, ladies and gentlemen. The book is called The President's Man. It's written by Dwight Chapin, who was a big cog in the Nixon White House, and he wrote a book called The President's Man. This KGVO Book Club going on right now. We'd love to have your thoughts and comments about it if you haven't read it, or if you'd like to read it. Dr. Mehrdad Key is on the phone. Dr. Michael Mayer here in the studio. Gentlemen, please go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that we got to right before the break is what do people think of when they think of Richard Nixon? And Joan Hoff, who is an excellent historian, in fact, comes from Butte, and did her BA and MA at the University of Montana before doing her PhD at Berkeley. And she taught for many years at University of Indiana and Ohio University. Wrote a book called Nixon Reconsidered, and she said when people think of Nixon, the first thing they think of is Watergate. And then they think of his foreign policy, which they think is really quite impressive. And then they think of his domestic policy. And her argument was it should be or maybe not exactly opposite, but certainly very different. She said, in reality, his domestic policy was his greatest achievement. His foreign policy was okay. She's not so impressed by it. I think others are much more so. And that Watergate was kind of an afterthought. Well, Watergate's more than an afterthought, obviously. And Nixon's foreign policy certainly has been criticized by some, especially on the Republican right, since his administration, because Nixon and Kissinger basically managed the Cold War. Reagan wanted to win it. And so, but at the time, managing the Cold War seemed like a better idea than World War III. But I think that there's a real good point there. Chapin points out that in terms of domestic policy, Nixon established the Council for Urban Affairs, established the Environmental Protection Agency, signed Title IX, started a war on cancer, created the National Cancer Institute, signed the 26th Amendment that gave 18-year-olds the vote. His administration, and Chapin doesn't go into this much, but his administration really redefined affirmative action, which began under Johnson, which simply meant literally taking affirmative steps to make sure minority candidates were considered fully in the pool. The idea of set-asides and preferences really comes more from the Nixon administration. Nixon also spent more on Great Society programs than Lyndon Johnson did.
Wow.
He ended the draft. And with respect to Native Americans, he ended the termination policy, restored tribal sovereignty. And among the things that Chapin doesn't mention that would support that view.
Now, we've got people to remember he had 2 terms.
Right. Well, 1.5.
Yeah, sorry.
But OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Hazards Administration, he resorted to wage and price controls in an attempt to deal with inflation. He built more units of public housing in his first 3 years than all previous administrations combined. He signed the Clean Air Act. He increased budgets for the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. His administration banned cigarette advertising on television and radio.
Wow, I forgot about that.
He proposed legislation that would have required employers to provide health insurance to their employees. That didn't get through Congress. And offered, and this is just barely mentioned in Chapin's book, but what was called the Family Assistance Plan, which would have replaced welfare with sort of a negative income tax, a guaranteed annual income. And that did not go through Congress either. But when you look at all that, that's it's not only an impressive list of accomplishments and suggestions, but it's also not a particularly conservative one. None of those things would be associated with conservative positions. Nixon was flexible, I think, on domestic issues. He was not especially opposed to the New Deal when he was in the Senate.
Well, what was his Congress like? I mean, was his Congress pro-Nixon, anti-Nixon, or?
His Congress was Democratic.
Yeah.
He was elected in 1968 in a very, very tight election, at least in terms of the popular vote. The Electoral College wasn't so close. He got 301 electoral votes, but he only got 43.5% of the vote.
Wow.
Which normally is the loser. George Wallace got a bunch, but he was within a percentage point. Hubert Humphrey came within a percentage point of him.
Wow. It
was a very, very tight election. And Nixon actually got, I think it was 2.3 million fewer votes in 1968 when he won than he did in 1960 when he lost. And so part of Nixon's domestic record is the fact that he didn't have a mandate. Part of it is the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress throughout his entire term, or term and a half. But it's also true that many of these were Nixon initiatives, and some of these were executive branch things that didn't have to go through Congress, like the creation of EPA or OSHA.
Right.
And in that respect, Nixon was not really a domestic conservative.
Well, what do you think? We'd love to have your thoughts this morning. If you haven't read the book, if you'd like to find out more about it, the book is called The President's Man. Dwight Chapin is the author, and this is the KGVO Book Club. So we're about a minute away from a break. We'll go ahead and take it right now. We'd love to have your phone calls this morning. Dr. Key is on the phone with us from the University of Montana, from his palatial office overlooking the magnificent fog-shrouded campus of the University of Montana. Anyway, and Dr. Michael Mayer, Professor Emeritus, joining us here in the studio. We're coming right back. Hopefully get your phone calls right after this.
Dennis Bragg with the updated weather. Snow or mixed rain and snow showers likely today, although accumulations will continue to be minimal in all but the higher passes and valleys. Still be prepared for wintry driving, especially tonight, as lows will drop down into the upper teens. Tuesday brings a little sun, not much warmer, reaching highs only in the mid-30s for the afternoon. Another chance of snow for the higher valleys and passes Wednesday, and we're watching for possible rain, a little warmer weather the end of the week with a chance of snow next weekend.
We are back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. And, of course, you can use the KGVO app. We'd love to hear from that as well. Joining us here in the studio this morning, we have Dr. Michael Mayer, Professor Emeritus at UM. Dr. Mehrdad Key is on the phone. The book that we're covering in the KGVO Book Club, which is going on until 10 o'clock this morning, is called The President's Man. So, gentlemen, take it away, please.
Building on what Mike already said, I think there are also points of very important accomplishments in terms of his foreign policy. We have mentioned China and we have mentioned Russia. He negotiated with both, and he had, of course, the support of an impressive group of foreign policy analysts and those who really understood, how the world basically functioned and how the power play was being carried out by both the Chinese and the Russians. But we should not also forget he played a very important role in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the Yom Kippur War. This was a very important event because for the first time the Egyptians and Syrians had the surprise element. They actually attacked during the Jewish holiday Yom Kippur, and for the first time Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, sort of went on a defensive and actually lost some territory. But in what was at the time controversial, but I know more and more now, people realize he was very quick and he was very proactive. Together with Henry Kissinger, they actually supplied Israel with badly needed arms and spare parts, and the fate of that war was reversed thanks to United States emergency help to the Jewish state. He was also a person who backed a very strong sense of commitment to various regions of the world. In case of the Middle East, for example, he stood with the so-called Nixon doctrine, which actually relied on U.S. allies in the region at the time, Israel, Turkey, Iran, to maintain stability against radical regimes such as the one in Iraq and Syria. And, of course, in that, he was, for me, now in retrospect, when you look at it, he had a genius in terms of foreign policy. And I was a bit, baffled by grading him as normal in terms of foreign policy. I think if you look at him and compare him and contrast him with some of his successors, I think he was greatly successful, in fact, in accomplishing many aspects of his foreign policy agenda.
Well, gentlemen, let's get right to the phones. We have Ben waiting to visit with you. Ben, good morning. You're on with Drs. Kia and Mayer. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Professor Mayer. Hi, Professor Kia. There's a passage in Chapter 5 wherein chapter claims that Johnson asked the FBI to look into members of Senator Barry Goldwater's staff. I'm wondering if you can comment on the scope and scale of Johnson's use of the FBI and the state to spy on his political opponents, and how that compared to Nixon's use of the state against his political opponents. And could Johnson have been charged with the same offenses as Nixon was for Watergate? Thank you.
All right. Good question.
Good question. Very good questions. Johnson used the FBI extensively against his political opponents. Some of it was almost voluntary by Hoover. Hoover had done this for presidents since at least the 1930s, and sort of surveilled political opponents and passed on material to presidents. And Johnson was an enthusiastic user of that. The FBI bugged Martin Luther King Jr.'s hotel rooms, motel rooms, captured his various affairs as well as other things on them, and used that against him. And Johnson was at that point probably the most extensive user of the FBI specifically against political opponents. And one of the ironies is that while Nixon is known for because of the tapes suggesting things, Nixon was often blocked by the bureaucracy because they hated Nixon, and by Hoover, who by this time had come to realize that this could really blow up his agency, the agency he'd built, and his own position in that. So Hoover had become much more cautious by the late 60s about so-called black bag operations, in other words, break-ins and other counterintelligence programs the FBI had, although they continued to run them. But they were much more cautious than they had been. And so it's interesting that while Nixon had attempted to use the government, he was less successful in doing that, if you want to call it a success, than Lyndon Johnson had been.
Yeah, so I think, Mike, of course, is the expert, and he can correct me, that though the polls at the time basically agreed that Johnson would easily win against Goldwater of Arizona, but Johnson was determined to, win a landslide because he wanted to implement his Great Society vision without any resistance and sort of go down in history as one of the country's greatest president. In some way, was it called Johnson's anti-campaign, something like this, to actually create a kind of smear campaign against Goldwater's candidacy? And it was run apparently from second floor of the West Wing by, I've heard people like Leonard Marks, who became the director of the U.S. Information Agency, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was at the time an assistant secretary of labor, and then later a U.S. senator from New York. So, these kinds of, it's fascinating that, there was this entire operation basically to more or less attack Goldwater in order to make Johnson win a big landslide against him.
Well, we have a minute before we take a break. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually going to go back to something Mehrdad said about the foreign policy, because I agree with him that Joan Huff's dismissal of his foreign policy, as I said, I thought that was overdone. But I think there are two things, two words to keep in mind, or two concepts. One was détente, which was better relations with the Soviets, less confrontational, and also with China. The other was triangular relations, which was using the U.S. policy since the late 40s under Truman had been to contain the spread of communism, and the term containment described American foreign policy. Well, some people say Nixon abandoned that. I don't think he did, but he sought a cheaper and more efficient way of doing it, which was to let the two communist powers contain each other. They had an enormous border with each other. There were literally millions of troops along that border. They were shooting at each other. That's a pretty good sign the honeymoon is over. And while American administrations from Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson understood the Sino-Soviet split as it developed, Nixon's was the first administration to make it a focal point of policy and to use warmer relations with China to contain the Soviet Union. And so, I mean, again, going back to Mehrdad's point, Nixon was a creative thinker in terms of foreign policy.
And with that, we are up against a break. We have all of our phone lines open. The book is called The President's Man, written by Dwight Chapin, who was, of course, in the Nixon White House and all the way to the bitter end. So 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. We'd love to have your thoughts, comments, and we will continue right after this.
The Library of Congress invites you to visit the revamped Veterans History Project website, where firsthand accounts shared by U.S. military veterans are accessible to the public. Performing a search of the collection is easy. First, go to loc.gov/vets. Click Explore the Collections. Scroll down to Search the VHP Collections and click. Make sure you're searching this collection, and with simple keywords, you can find what you're looking for. Visit loc.gov/vets today.
Hey, welcome back to Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. I've been bending Dr. Mayr's ear, Dr. Michael Mayer here in the studio, and, of course, Dr. Mehrdad Kia on the phone. We're talking about the book called The President's Man. This is the KGVO Book Club, in case you just joined us, and you're wondering, what in the world are these guys talking about a book on the radio? This is what we do. It's a very popular show. But one of the things I was discussing with Michael was that I graduated from high school in 1971 and went to one glorious, disappointing year of college at the University of Montana and bombed out. But I will say that the beginning of my interest in politics was actually through what happened in Watergate, and just watching that in shocked horror as to this is our president who's being accused of all these horrible things, and they had these tapes, and so the saga went on and on and on for a couple of years during his presidency.
Yeah, and the question you raised, why in the world did Nixon do that?
Right.
The best guess is that he wanted a record of his administration. He was very distrustful of the media. He was distrustful of historians, and in both cases with good reason.
Right.
The media, Nixon gave them some ammunition, but the media certainly mistreated Nixon at times throughout his career, and I suspect that was because he wanted an accurate record. The real question is why didn't he burn those tapes before? I mean, again, if the tapes had been destroyed, he'd probably still be president. But it's an interesting question. Chapin makes an interesting observation about the tapes, and he refers to them repeatedly throughout the book. And he says that the parts of some of it is just Nixon letting off steam. He wasn't really going to do this. He was just fuming. And I think there's an element of truth in that. Part of it is also, it's a very small percentage, these dramatic things that we're all familiar with. Whether it's the anti-Semitic rantings or these other things, are very, very small percentages. It doesn't mean it's. I'm not endorsing.
But that's the thing. People who want to criticize him will immediately point out. Right.
But as Chapin points out, it is. It's a very small percentage of the actual tapes, and they're there. There's no question about it. And Nixon makes some ugly statements and comments about minority groups and the famous reference that he doesn't give a blank about the lira. His foreign policy was more sophisticated than that. Again, so I think there are two elements to consider.
It's like locker room conversations.
Yeah, but all presidents swear. All presidents let off steam. In most cases, we don't have recordings of that at least that have been public. But and again, this isn't to excuse any of it, but it is to put some context to it that we have these recordings. What we know are the small percentage of the total time on tape that are these scandalous sorts of things. And that some of the things that Nixon tells Haldeman to do, as Chapin observes, Haldeman understood Nixon was just blowing off steam, and he had no intention of turning around and turning that into policy. It was just Nixon letting off steam, and so I think those are things to consider. Again, this is not to say that Nixon's involvement in the cover-up or his anti-Semitic or racist comments are in any way laudable, but they're not the whole thing of the tapes.
Tom, hang on.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have callers waiting to get on the line, and we're going to start with Jim. All right, let's get Jim on the line here. Okay, Jim, good morning. You're on Talkback with our KGVO Book Club hosts. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm only partway through the book, but there's something that just fascinated me about Chapin and his writing and his experience, and I'm going to comment that he is a classic case of Eric Hoffer's true believer. And if you gentlemen want to comment on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for the call.
I think that Jim's right. There's an element. He says at the end of the book, I'm still a Nixon man. And he was. And the title of the book is The President's Man. And that's how he regarded himself. And he looked at Nixon with a certain amount of awe and admiration, although it's not an uncritical portrait. He understands that Nixon was an incredibly complicated human being with all kinds of flaws, but that just the one side of Nixon that people tend to be familiar with is not the whole story. Nixon was such an enigmatic figure. He is an intensely private person. Chapin describes him as an introvert, as other people have. Strange career choice for an introvert to go into public life. He was awkward one-on-one, although Chapin says he was very good in small groups. Nixon was just a bundle of contradictions. He was enormously uncomfortable with public displays of emotion, and yet he was a very emotional person. The Chapin cites a number of instances where Nixon broke down in tears when Eisenhower died, which surprised me. The intensity of his emotional reaction to that.
It was his mentor,
and other things. But there was a really fraught relationship there too.
Okay.
And he was uncomfortable with personal confrontation. Even when it came to firing Chapin, he had somebody else do it. Haldeman, who was very close to Chapin, had somebody else do it. Nixon was just a bundle of contradictions, and Chapin's not unaware of it. But as Jim says, he's a supporter.
Tell you what, we're up against a break here, and Tom is waiting very patiently to get on the phone with us. And we have several other phone lines open. The book is called The President's Man, written by Dwight Chapin. And this is the KGVO Book Club. So if you have a question or a comment, we'd love to have you get in and join the show. We'll be right back after this timeout. We are back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. Now, Mehrdad, did you have a comment to go with what Michael said before we get back to our calls?
No, I think Michael hit the nail on the head. I find Chapin, fascinating because while, he goes into some big issues, and of course, he knew Henry Kissinger very closely. He was a close friend of Bob Haldeman and so on and so forth. But he had something to say about, individuals as far away as Chu En-lai and Pat Nixon, as well as Spiro Agnew, Edgar Hoover, but also Frank Sinatra and the famous Deep Throat, Mark Felt and so on and so forth. So as well as people like Roger Ailes, for example, and John Dean. So what makes the book very rich is, the not only the scope, but also the fascinating characteristics, of Nixon administration, which had to deal with a wide array of individuals and contacts and, from Coretta Scott King to others, So it's a fascinating sort of journey into the inner workings of an administration led by a very complex person, namely Richard Nixon, who was actually, for me, he's a very, aside from all the simplistic, the crook and so on and so forth, I think he was actually a very fascinating individual. He had negative personal characteristics, but he had some real, I think, positive and outstanding sort of elements to his personality. Mike mentioned something. I would add that though he has been considered as, firing all the people who surrounded him, he was also, on the other side, on the opposite side, a very loyal man. And personally, I know this because after the Iranian Revolution, when everybody was, forgetting that we had an ally, namely the Shah of Iran, being very close with the United States for 25 years, basically. And Richard Nixon, by the way, was the first American politician to visit Iran after the coup of August 1953. He remained very close to the Shah. And when the Shah was ailing and in a New York hospital, he actually visited him. Then he visited him when he was in exile. Shah was going from, different countries and so on and so forth. But he was the only U.S. president, former U.S. president, who actually participated in the Shah's funeral, basically expressing his loyalty to an old friend of the United States, while the administration in power, now we know, was actually negotiating with the Islamic regime in Iran with the possibility of maybe handing the Shah back to the Islamic regime. This actually does not give me a sense of a man who was sick or paranoid, but a man who was actually extremely loyal to the allies of the United States.
Okay, let's get one more call in before we have to take our break, and I believe it is Tom. Tom, good morning. You're on with our guest. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, good morning. I'd like to talk a little bit about 1974. Unfortunately, I was gone through a period of time when I was very sick for about 6 weeks there with something, and I was home glued to the TV watching the Watergate hearings, and people think today that we're really involved in what's going on a day-to-day basis. Well, the whole country was very, very involved with the Watergate hearings back then. And what amazes me nowadays is the lack of the curiosity of the news media during the last 4 years of President Biden's administration. With there's no investigative journalists out there, and we had 4 years of investigating Donald Trump on charges that weren't. There was nothing to them with the Russia stuff. So anyway, I'd just like to have them comment on the lack of curiosity in the news media when when it seems like the more liberal administrations are in power. So Thanks very much.
Thanks for the call. We got the gentleman. We have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Well, I think some of that it was true in the 1960s as well. I mean, the media was less curious about some of the abuses of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, which, as Mehrdad pointed out a while back, were very similar to the abuses of the Nixon administration. Much more aggressive in going after Nixon. It doesn't mean that I think. One of the differences between Kennedy and Johnson on the one hand and Nixon on the other than the fact that the bureaucracy was more favorably inclined toward Kennedy and Johnson, was that Nixon did so on a wider scale, which means the more you do it, the more likely you are to get caught. And that's I think, the determining factor, is that Nixon got caught. Kennedy and Johnson used the IRS against political enemies. Nixon wanted to do so, got thwarted, but he managed to do it a little bit. And I think, again, one of the differences is if you do stuff a lot, you're more likely to get caught.
Mehrdad, we have exactly 1 minute. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think in some ways that tradition has continued. It is very, very unfortunate to see where the U.S. media has gone, especially more recently. I agree with Tom. It was, I have to tell you, it was disturbing, not as a Democrat or a Republican, but as an observer of the performance of the media. And I think I said it before the election. In some ways, objective journalism, or I should say in-depth analytical journalism, has died. And we used to make fun of the Soviet Union and Pravda and all the propaganda networks, and you just turn on the TV, these CNN, MSNBC, and so on and so on, even Fox, exactly where they're going to come from. They have become...
This is Talkback, 721-1290 or 1-800-568-5309.
This is Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 98.3 FM. KGVO, Missoula's news and weather station.
Welcome back, everybody. It's hour number 2 of Talkback. Talkback this morning is brought to you by our friends at Phillips Janitorial. No job is too big or small for Phillips, residential or commercial and commercial. Give them a call today, 406-260-6617. Also brought to you by 123 Seamless Gutters. They offer free estimates. Now that winter's on the cusp here, very close, let 123 Seamless Gutters handle everything that has to do with your gutters, so you don't have to. Call 240-2669. Also brought to you by Y West Storage out of the Y. If you need storage, give them a call, 406-510-0590, because they're making room for you. And also brought to you this morning by Harrington Surgical Supply. Appointments are preferred for mastectomy fittings and custom compressions, but walk-ins are always welcome.
The views and opinions expressed on Talkback are not those of the staff, management, or advertisers.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Good to have you along. We have the KGVO Book Club rolling right along this morning. Joining us on the phone is Dr. Mehrdad Kia, who is at the University of Montana right now, and then Dr. Michael Mayer, Professor Emeritus at UM, here joining us in the studio. The book is called The President's Man. It's written by Dwight Chapin, and those of you who are in our time of life, we'll remember that name. And we have Ben, who's been waiting very patiently on the phone. So let's go ahead. Should we just set the groundwork first before we get Ben's call? Those who may have just joined us.
Well, for those who have just joined us, The President's Man is a book by one of Nixon's aides. It's a takeoff on the title All the President's Men by Woodward and Bernstein, reporters who broke a lot of stories about Watergate. And although, again, we tend to think that only the Washington Post was on that story. New York Times was on that story, too.
Sure.
And that comes out in Chapin's memoirs as well.
Yeah.
But,
All right.
let's go to Ben.
Let's get Ben on the line. All right. Ben, good morning. Welcome back. You're on Talkback. Go ahead, please.
Oh, yes. Thanks for taking another one of my questions. In the final chapters, Chapin suggests that much academic research should be conducted on the CIA's involvement in Watergate. To what extent do you believe the CIA may have indeed been involved with Watergate, and is this an area of historical research that merits the attention of academic historians? I think Chapin also mentioned that there were some White House tapes that became public as a result of a lawsuit in '95. Is there anything in those records that might change the historiography regarding Watergate, or is that history largely settled? Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for the call, Ben.
Yeah, thanks. And those are two really good questions. The question of the CIA, there are things that are suggestive to some people. I don't think it's realistic to suggest that the CIA was involved in Watergate in the sense that they weren't involved in the planning, although there were ex-CIA operatives who were involved. But most of that stuff came from the committee to reelect the president. And
creep,
and they were tasked by Magruder and Mitchell, and John Mitchell was Nixon's former law partner as Attorney General, who resigned to take over the Nixon campaign in 1972. And Jeb Magruder was a figure in the White House, and then with a committee to reelect the president. And some of the people that they relied on or hired were in fact ex-CIA, one or two ex-FBI. I think it's because for that sort of intelligence work, that's who you go to. I'm not sure there's much credible evidence that the CIA was involved in that. The CIA did turn down the Nixon administration's attempt to get them to block the FBI investigation by saying, "Look, this is national security stuff." This, but that's functioning as they should properly. So I'm not sure about that. The tapes, there wasn't much on the tapes that were released later, and that's new. There's more ugly stuff from Nixon, and they spent a lot of time playing that on nightly news programs. And there's more sort of pedestrian, mundane stuff. Nixon's machines were voice activated, so they caught pretty much everything that was going on. And a lot of what goes on in the course of a day is not all that interesting. But again, some of the more salacious bits were taken out, and a big deal was made about them. I'm not sure that any of this stuff will alter the fundamental narrative, to use a term people like these days, which is that Nixon's aides did abuse the government and their power. They were ultimately responsible for the break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. On the other hand, there's no evidence that Nixon himself knew about that in advance. And yet the smoking gun tape, as it's called, indicates that Nixon was involved in the cover-up from the very early stages. And I think that basic narrative that Nixon and probably Haldeman and probably Ehrlichman had no prior knowledge of it, but that they were involved in a cover-up of it from the earliest stages of the cover-up is probably going to hold up.
Mehrdad, got about a minute before we take a break, and then Helen is waiting for us on the other side.
I don't think a minute would do, but former intelligence officer E. Howard Hunt, who was known as the central person in bugging Watergate, these guys, by the way, were a bit kind of, I think, surprised by the fact that they had done similar things even before Nixon. For example, we know that, Ben had asked about Goldwater, and we know, for example, Goldwater's travel schedule and advanced copies of his remarks were provided by somebody in the CIA who had been planted in Goldwater's headquarters. Hunt himself actually mentioned that he had been ordered to infiltrate the Goldwater campaign, and he had questioned the order, only be told that he had been personal request of President Johnson. And I think it's interesting to note that CIA Director William Colby had confirmed the White House role in illegal surveillance during the Johnson administration. So I think the CIA has been involved in one way or another with each and every administration, and they were a bit surprised. Of course, there is illegality here in the case of Nixon, and I'm not trying to whitewash it, but I think these kinds of involvements and activities were not new, and the first time under Nixon they had been operating under shadows, basically in previous administrations as well.
Just one thing quickly to add to what Mehrdad said, because it's an important point. The CIA, under its charter, is specifically prohibited from engaging in domestic surveillance and counterintelligence activities. Oops is a big point. And so, and Mehrdad's point about this going on in earlier administrations is also an important one. But anytime the CIA spies on American citizens, that's a no-no. It's outside of its charter.
And it's illegal.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to come right back. Helen is waiting very patiently, and we have 7 other phone lines open. We'd love to hear from you. The book is called The President's Man, written by Dwight Chapin, about the White House years under President Nixon. So 721-1290 is our number. We'd love to hear from you right after this.
Hey, guess what?
Dennis Bragg with the updated weather. Snow or mixed rain and snow showers likely today, although accumulations will continue to be minimal in all but the higher passes and valleys. Still be prepared for wintry driving, especially tonight, as lows will drop down into the upper teens. Tuesday brings a little sun, not much warmer, reaching highs only in the mid-30s for the afternoon. Another chance of snow for the higher valleys and passes Wednesday, and we're watching for possible rain, a little warmer weather the end of the week with a chance of snow next weekend.
We are back. More calls coming in for the KGVO Book Club. As a matter of fact, we have Helena, Joe, and Jeff all standing by. But Mehrdad, I know you wanted to make a point before we continued further, please.
Yeah, no, building on what Mike correctly said, that CIA is prohibited by law from operating within the United States. Though that is the law, I think even before Nixon, for example, during presidency of President Johnson, didn't really matter in some ways. I mean, if you read, for example, I think John Roach was president of Americans for Democratic Action. He actually testified that, and I actually found the quote, we used to get advance copy of Senator Goldwater's key speeches. He actually admitted, enabling us to have speakers primed to reply before Goldwater had even opened his mouth. That tells you that there were agents or, folks basically planted in the opposition or the opponent's campaign in order to give heads up. So Johnson's campaign could actually respond to them even before they opened their mouth, which tells you something, how active these so-called informants were. And they were not coming from Moon or Mars. They were actually coming from the intelligence community.
All right, let's get right back to the phones and say good morning to Joe. Joe, good morning. You're on Talkback on the KGVO Book Club. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems to me what Comey did to the Trump campaign in 2016, whenever he announced, is far more severe than what the Nixon or the Republicans did in the White.
Watergate.
Anyway, if you could look at Watergate, thank you. And if you could just juxtapose those two and put them in perspective, because I know that they did have a couple of honeypots from the FBI, female honeypots, that they planted in the Trump campaign. So,
all right, thanks for the call, sir. Gentlemen, go ahead.
Well, there's a distinction that's worth making, and that Comey was with the FBI, and this is not to justify his activities. I mean, the FBI's willing participation in building this case of Russian collusion that didn't exist is inexcusable.
The FBI is domestic.
But the FBI is domestic. Right. So it's not quite the same as the CIA. It's not laudable. It's not proper. It's not legal, I don't think. But it's a little bit different. It's just a distinction worth considering.
Mehrdad.
Yeah. No, I don't have anything to add. I agree with Mike, and I think there is a bit of a distinction here. Yeah.
So Helena is back. Helena, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I had an additional question. Thanks for taking my call. I was wondering if your guest could talk a little bit more about Nixon's policies, foreign policies in the Middle East, specifically, since that's so much in the news today, and also his foreign policy in South Asia. Thank you.
Mike, go for it.
Okay. Well, Nixon's policies in the Middle East were, again, pretty sophisticated. Mehrdad's point about Nixon being a strategic thinker in terms of foreign policy is an important one, and the same thing's true of Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, and then Secretary of State and national security advisor. He held both at the same time. And then as just Secretary of State. Kissinger was a professor from Harvard who in 1957 wrote a book called Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, which is a very, it's a classic. It's one of the most important books written about strategic theory at that time. And it still has a certain relevance. His argument was that the reliance on nuclear weapons as a deterrent had limits because nobody really believes you're going to use them. And so that if the Soviets put a division into Angola, are you really going to use nuclear weapons? And so that therefore they become almost not useless, but kind of impotent weapons. And Nixon very much agreed along general lines with Kissinger. I think Chapin makes the point that people talk about the Nixon-Kissinger foreign policy, which is a good way to talk about it because Nixon was president and he also had sophisticated ideas. And his view of the Middle East was balanced by support for Israel, an attempt, again, everything during the Nixon administration was seen through the prism of the Cold War. The Soviets were backing the Arab states. And so that had something to that had something to do with it. And also he was interested in access to Mideast oil. And again, this is particularly true, not just for the United States, which was much less dependent on Mideast oil than it would later become, but for America's European allies, who depended very heavily.
Hey, gentlemen, we are up against a break. We have Jeff and George both waiting to visit with you. Several other phone lines open. In case you just stumbled onto this great program, it's called the KGVO Book Club. And we our guests, of course, our hosts, I should say, Dr. Michael Mayer here in the studio, Professor Emeritus at UM, Dr. Mehrdad Kia, History Professor at UM. And the book is we're studying today. There will be a test. The President's Man by Dwight Chapin. So we will come right back.
Mehrdad will do the grading.
There you go. I hear he's really an easy grader. So anyway, stay with us. We'll be right back. Yeah, your students have been talking. We'll be back right after this.
Montana State News Network.
I'm Dennis Bragg. It may be the craziest week in Montana as the stage is set for this week's Brawl of the Wild, with both the Cats and Grizz winning over the weekend. After a moribund first half, UM came on strong to beat Portland State 28-17. MSU showed real strength, outlasting UC Davis 30-28. That sets up the high-profile showdown this year in Bozeman. It's not just football players reaching for the stars at Montana State, as Devin Brosnan reports.
Could Montana be the next big name in space exploration? Montana State University just made history with its first ever night flight in the Borealis High Altitude Ballooning Project, where students tackled the unique challenges of navigating near space at night. This mission, launched from Bozeman, tested critical skills like temperature control and low-light navigation, mimicking some of the same demands that future space missions will face. So as Montana students push boundaries in atmospheric and space research, we may just be witnessing the beginning of a new frontier right here in Big Sky Country. In Bozeman, Devin Brosnan, Montana News Network.
Federal authorities expressing confidence they'll be able to catch 2 suspects still on the run as a massive investigation results in the convictions for 27 others involved in a large-scale drug trafficking operation. Jesse Laslovich, the U.S. Attorney for Montana, says the case started more than 2 years ago.
These were folks who were on the Northern Cheyenne and Crow reservations and in Billings who were dealing in pounds and pounds and pounds of meth, thousands and thousands of fentanyl pills.
Laslovich says the spear-sighting trafficking organization moved on to the Crow and Northern Cheyenne reservations to exploit and prey on persons addicted to meth and fentanyl, all due to what he calls greed. Travel across parts of Montana, and especially the passes, will remain tricky today as we continue to receive snow. After the passage of a weekend cold front, some of the heaviest snows have been around West Yellowstone and along the Idaho-Montana border through the Centennial Mountains south of Dillon, where a winter storm warning remains in effect until this evening. This is the Montana State News Network.
If I could be you.
And you could be me for just 1 hour.
If you could find a way
to get inside each other's mind.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
We've all felt left out. And for some, that feeling lasts more than a moment. We can change that. Learn how at belongingbeginswithus.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
We're back on Talk
Here's
Back.
a fun fact for you. The average chameleon can point their eyes in 2 different directions. On the other hand, the average human can't. So unless you're a chameleon, there's absolutely no way you can focus on texting and driving at the same time. So don't do it, unless you're a chameleon.
Visit StopTextsStopWrecks.org. A message brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Project Yellow Light, and the Ad Council.
Okay, now it's my turn. 721-1290 is our number. Darn those commercials. Anyway, joining us here on the phone is Dr. Mehrdad Kia, here in the studio, Dr. Michael Mayer. Now, Mehrdad, I know you wanted to make a couple of points before we get back to our calls, so please go ahead.
Going back to Helena's questions, first of all, on South Asia, Richard Nixon, and even before Nixon comes to the White House, they were facing a very puzzling situation. China and Pakistan were becoming very close allies, while India and the Soviet Union were getting closer and closer, especially under the reign of the Indian National Congress. There was, of course, a confrontation between Pakistan and India, which turned into a war. And, of course, in the process, East Pakistan separated itself from West Pakistan and created the country of Bangladesh. And both, of course, had and developed a much more sophisticated nuclear program with nuclear capabilities. So Nixon's challenge was basically to maintain a balance, not lose India, but also keep Pakistan as an ally, especially the Pakistani military, which had control over Pakistan's nukes, basically. There, I think they actually played the game very intelligently, and without undermining the relationship with India, they still maintain a very close relationship with Pakistan. On the question of Middle East, Mike was absolutely correct. I think he was very much committed to the security of Israel. He was very, very conscious of the importance of the oil from Persian Gulf, not only for United States, but also for its European allies, as well as South Korea and Japan. And for that reason, of course, Iran began to play a very important role. Remember, the Shah was called sometimes as the policeman of the Gulf because he basically, through Iranian naval forces, maintained sort of security in the Straits of Hormuz, because that's where the bloodline went through. That is where the oil tankers went through. And as such, Iran also received significant U.S. military aid. The relationship with Turkey was also very important. United States had created the CENTO, Central Treaty Organization, which included Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. CENTO was more or less the eastern extension of the NATO into the Middle East, and the northern tier countries, especially Turkey and Iran, played a central role in protecting U.S. interest in the region.
Well, before we get to the next caller, just one more point about Nixon in the Middle East is that Nixon's policy effectively, after the 1973 war, ejected the Soviets from the Middle East.
Wow.
Which was, it enabled what would eventually become the rapprochement between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan. But more than that, from American strategic standpoint, it was a great achievement, which was given away again by the Obama administration, who invited the Russians, not the Soviets anymore, but invited the Russians back in with the business about Syria and Assad, which struck me as an unwise decision.
Okay, let's go ahead and get... Go ahead.
The thing about very interesting is that in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Egypt had made advances and had gained some territory in the Sinai Peninsula. At the time when the war ended, the main Egyptian army had been encircled by the Israeli forces and could be destroyed. But very interesting, this is I think the very intelligent decision by both President Nixon and Henry Kissinger not to destroy Egyptian forces on the Sinai the way Israel had destroyed them in the 1967 June War, for the simple reason that they had understood that Anwar Sadat, the new president of Egypt, was not Nasser, a pro-Soviet, gung-ho warmonger, but a man who was eventually interested in peace with Israel. He understood that wars against Israel were futile and would not be to the interest of at least Egypt. For that reason, they actually allowed Sadat to get away with a limited, very limited victory, if you can call it that, in order for him to survive and in order for him to continue negotiations with Israel, which culminated in the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, peace for the first time between an Arab country and the Jewish state, which actually tells you that though Jimmy Carter gets some recognition for negotiating that peace treaty, it had all started under Nixon, and it continued under Ford administration before it actually came to conclusion under President Carter.
And as always, your time is exquisite because we're right up against a break. 721-1290 is our number. This is the KGVO Book Club, in case you just turned on. And, well, what are they talking about? Well, we're talking about a book called The President's Man by Dwight Chapin. That's the book for this month at the KGVO Book Club. Dr. Kia on the phone, Dr. Mayer here in the studio. And we'll come back. We have Jeff and George both waiting to weigh in on that topic when we come back right after this. We are back. This is Talk Back again, the KGVO Book Club. We're rolling right along. The book is called The President's Man, written by Dwight Chapin, who was in the Nixon White House. Dr. Mehrdad Kia on the phone, Dr. Michael Mayer here in the studio. And folks have been waiting very, very patiently. And let's go ahead and jump in here. Jeff, thank you for your patience, sir. You're on with our guests. Go ahead.
You bet. When you said Dwight Chapin, I was thinking Dwight Yoakam, and I was
different guy.
Or better yet, how about Harry Chapin? Go ahead.
That too. Before I get to my questions, though, you made a comment about the CIA not being allowed to spy on the U.S. citizens, and that was the case. But FISA overturned everything. It is completely, in my mind, as a former intelligence professional, evil and easily manipulated. For example, there's a consortium out there called Five Eyes, which is the U.S., United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and they share intelligence freely. And in the Trump-Russia collusion nonsense, the U.S. was not collecting on Trump, but they were getting information from their Five Eyes allies that they could look at because they didn't collect it. So it was legitimate stuff in their mind. And FISA has made the FBI part of the intelligence community for the first time, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. It's a law enforcement agency. It's not an intelligence community asset. So that's my rant for that. I just don't want people to think that, oh, yeah, CIA is not going to look at you. No, they will in any way they can.
Okay.
But my questions are about first of all, the author. When I looked at it, it seemed like he was pretty young when he went into the White House, and I was wondering how much of his youthful exuberance played in his own downfall. And then more importantly, Nixon had a distrust of bureaucracies, and you've alluded to that, and that he did not trust many people, and yet a supposed Republican president went out and created all these agencies that you talked about, and I'm wondering why would someone who hated bureaucracy create more bureaucracy? Did the book provide any insight into that, or can you provide any insight? Because it seems like almost at a psychological level, he might have been currying favor with his opponents, trying to win them over by saying, look how good I am, rather than just fighting them like the current or the next administration looks like it's going to do.
Jeff, thanks for the call.
Thanks, Jeff.
Go ahead.
That's a really good question, and the book doesn't give an answer. It gives an answer about his youth. He was in his 20s when he went to the White House. But the question about why would someone who distrusted bureaucracy create OSHA, EPA, and so on is a question. Nixon, I go back to the point that Mehrdad and I started with. Nixon is an enigma. He is a bundle of contradictions, which is why I think he will continue to fascinate historians. But that's just the sort of thing that is so true of Nixon. And I just, Mehrdad probably has something to say about it too, but I just want to go off on one little tangent there. Some people regard Nixon as a racist. Nixon was one of the strongest supporters of civil rights in the Eisenhower administration. And Chapin tells a fascinating story that I was not aware of, that when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Nixon arranged to go visit the King family in Atlanta and made sure that the press would not be aware of it. And he went to the King's home, Martin Luther King Jr.'s home. And he'd known King since 1957. They met in Ghana during the independence ceremonies, and they became friendly, and they remained friendly. And I hadn't realized how close. I knew that, but I hadn't realized how close the families were. And when Nixon went to the King home, Coretta Scott King was up in her bedroom. And she wasn't really receiving people. I mean, she was up and dressed and so on, but she wasn't really receiving people. But she received Nixon in her bedroom, which indicates a certain familiarity, comfort. Who do you let into that situation? People you know well, and
especially in that time of grief.
Yeah, exactly. And they had a conversation, and then Nixon asked to be taken to Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr.'s home. And when they encountered each other, the two men embraced. Nixon had known Daddy King longer than he'd known Martin Luther King Jr., and he was close with them. And Nixon was a supporter of the Civil Rights Act of '57. One of the ironies is that Kennedy voted with Southerners to weaken it. He voted for it ultimately. But in 1960, Nixon was furious because he thought he got about a third of the black vote, which is what Republicans got in those days. And he was furious. He thought he deserved more, and said some things that weren't terribly generous about black voters. And I mean, that's just Nixon is just. I mean, when Jeff's question goes back, who the hell knows is the answer.
Right. Yeah, and I guess what I would say is one would imagine that particular part of the political philosophy, the African Americans, should have known about that close friendship between King and Nixon. And obviously they kept it a secret because they wanted it to be private. Mm-hmm. So,
although it was interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Mehrdad.
What you're hearing us say this, I mean, both with regard to the issue of, relationship with the King family and even in terms of its foreign policy, what are you hearing? What you're hearing is that there was far greater consensus between the two parties with regard to a lot of issues. I mean, some of the things Nixon actually accomplished during his presidency, which was listed brilliantly by Mike, it tells you that he was actually a very moderate person, and he had some progressive ideas and addressing some of the issues which were shared in common with his opponents in the Democratic Party. I think the same thing can be said about the foreign policy. There was a much more of a bipartisan consensus when it came to U.S. foreign policy moves. And I'm not speaking just about, we talked about South Asia to a degree and the Middle East, but I think in the rest of the world, in terms of standing up to the Soviet Union, it was a bipolar world, and it was divided between United States and its allies, and on the other hand, Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and its allies across the globe. But it's very interesting. Now you compare it with today, and you realize how far the two parties have gone to away from bipartisanship and arguing on each and every situation, to the point that on foreign policy we would have had a very different approach toward Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict if Vice President Kamala Harris had become the president, than the situation now with President Trump coming to the White House.
One would think, and before we get to our break, and we also have George and Elena both waiting to visit with you, gentlemen. When we come back, one would think, especially today, that any politician would want that relationship, if I was Richard Nixon, to let the whole world know that I'm good friends with Martin Luther King Jr., put the arm around the shoulder, the whole bit, just simply for political gain. And obviously they thought it was important to keep that relationship private because I'm sure the things they spoke about were between two men.
Yeah, I think that's true. Although it is true that after the prayer pilgrimage in 1957, it was Nixon who received King in the White House, not Eisenhower. Right. It was Nixon was the conduit for King to the White House. So it's somewhat. But again, that's it's somewhat public, but it's backdoor as well. I mean, very much. You're right. But Mehrdad's point is really well taken.
We're going to come right back. And again, we have George and Elena waiting to visit with you. The book is called The President's Man by Dwight Chapin. We're coming right back after this.
If your life...
You would do that. You would do that, Denny, when we have a policy in our studios, no food allowed in the studios. Come on now. All right, let us continue. We have folks waiting on the phone. This is the KGVO Book Club, by the way. The President's Man is the book. Dwight Chapin is the author. Dr. Mehrdad Kia is on the phone. Dr. Michael Mayer here in the studio. And let's go. This is George. Good morning. You're on Talkback with our guests. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. And I enjoy this book club, and I enjoy history, and I looked this book up. I haven't read it. I was just curious if Chapin, the author, who worked for Nixon, if he admitted any wrong that he did, or that the whole administration did, that he saw the wrong, and maybe the office culture or whatever it was that allowed that to happen. If he admitted that was wrong and apologized, because what I worry about is the whitewashing, because if the Watergate thing stands and there's really no difference, then that kind of disqualifies Nixon from then on. And I wonder, it's great that he worked and did the EPA and the OSHA earlier and did these other environmental things. That's great. That's really wonderful. I wonder if that's partly because of a Democratic Congress. He had to work together with the other side to get some things done. But I find it very disqualifying if there's not like an apology or an admission of wrong, because I looked up the book. I'd like to read the book, but I'm not sure if it's worth it because, if there's not something new,
there's no mea culpa.
Then, I just think that the moral compass is really important in a leader. And if a leader can't apologize, okay, I screwed up there. That was wrong, but now I recognize that and we're moving forward. I mean, I'm just kind of a purist at heart, and I think that's what I expect of my friends and my peers and my leaders in my little world. And, I'm not going to say, well, everybody does it. All the other presidents have done this. All these other administrations, all these other rulers back to Rome, they've always been corrupt. That's not the way I'm going to think about that. I think the best of people, and I'm not going to say, well, they just didn't get caught. That's just kind of where I'm coming from. I think a moral compass in a leader is extremely important. And if not, and they do something, then they're disqualified forever.
All right. So, well, George, thanks for the call. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks. There are a couple of things there. I think your point is a point I made earlier, that the Democratic Congress had something to do with Nixon's domestic policy, for sure. Although, again, it didn't. Also, Nixon's narrow victory. He didn't have a mandate to do anything. He was elected with 43.5% of the vote. That had something to do with it. But Nixon's own persuasions, as Mehrdad was talking about, in terms of domestic policy, influenced the course of the administration as well. Now, in terms of George's comment about apologies, I think it went back and forth. I couldn't follow exactly whether he was talking about Chapin or Nixon. Nixon apologized after leaving office many years later. Chapin certainly acknowledges that what he did was foolish. He points out repeatedly he didn't have anything to do with Watergate, but that that his engagement with the dirty tricks run out of the committee to reelect the president, and with tangential links to the White House, was a foolish thing to have done. And one of the more I guess, emotional segments of the book is when he talks about apologizing to his daughter for this. So I don't know if that meets George's criterion, but there you have it.
Mehrdad, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think. By the way, I really like George's comment, and I think it is a must. However cynical we might be or skeptical about what leaders have done in the past, that a leader, at least an ideal leader that we have in mind, has a moral compass in terms of judgments and policies. And I completely agree with him on that. I hear the apology on several occasions in the book, including the one that Mike mentioned, apologies even to his own daughter. Also, he went to jail for 9 months, and what is very interesting, and it's related to the question from George, is that he doesn't hold any grudge, and he thinks, though he was not involved directly in the Watergate itself, but he was involved in these kind of dirty games on the side, on the margins, and this was not right, and this should not have taken place. He understands that, and I think he admits to it, and the fact that he does not hold any grudge for his imprisonment clearly shows that he probably thought it was deserving. But I have to also say, while we do maintain that moral compass, you have to also understand that he put his life into this, and that is his career, that is his identity, that's the meaning of his life. He wanted to serve his country, and he adored Richard Nixon. So what he does in this book is basically he admits to mistakes, but he also does not believe that Richard Nixon was a crook. He thinks that's oversimplification, that he was a talented man, but he was a problematic person. He had issues, personal issues, and I would add some psychological issues in terms of paranoia and so on and so forth. So he wants to present his subject as more complex and complicated than someone who can be described with one or two adjectives. And of course, in all this, I think what looming in all this is his own career as a person, as a civil servant, who tried to accomplish things, though it proved to be, in the end, embarrassing and at times completely unacceptable.
And with that, we're going to take a 1-minute timeout. We have Elena waiting very patiently on the line. We have a 60-second timeout here. If you have a question or a comment, we'd love to have you be a part of the KGVO Book Club for the last 7 minutes or so. That's all the time we have left. We'll be back in 1 minute. We are back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. On the phone, Dr. Mehrdad Kia. Here in the studio, Dr. Michael Mayer. And let's jump right in here. And first of all, Elena, thank you for your patience, ma'am. What's on your mind?
You're welcome. Okay. I think George earlier or before me, hinted on something that I'm going to sort of go into. I was wondering if Chapin, who's, according to the book, Nixon's trusted aide, mentions anything about Nixon's connection and Watergate to New York and a small village called Bronxville.
In what context?
Anything that has to do with Watergate and the investigation of Watergate. I'll just give you a little hint. I was living in Bronxville, New York at the time of Watergate, and I was working with a certain utility and a lot of connections where I was, I don't want to go too deep into it, but in an investigation that had to do with a certain governor of New York and any connections with people in Bronxville. Are you familiar with the village of Bronxville by any chance?
Yes. In fact, that's where Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic. But there's nothing in Chapin's book about Bronxville.
Okay. Because Joseph Kennedy also lived there with the Kennedy family in Bronxville for a number of years. And very interesting. And so there's more to it, folks. There really is, with his connections. And I would think that Chapin sort of like colored it in favor of Nixon, but it goes deeper than there were more involved with that Watergate fiasco. But if you look up Bronxville, the village of,
I'm looking
and the
at,
connections.
Looking at it right now. I'm looking at a New York Times story that says...
there is in wealthy Republican Bronxville, the Watergate fallout. That's the New York Times article.
Yeah. So I also was involved with the utility that I dealt with, but I'll just leave it like that.
So you don't want to share with us anything more than that?
All right, I'll just tell you this. I worked for the telephone company, Ma Bell. And I was given the job of investigating all the calls that were made by a certain party, by the FBI getting involved with it. And so that was my job, to get all the calls that were made to a certain party.
Do you know anything about William Scott Kelly, who was a 44-year-old business executive who lived with his wife Barbara and 3 children, and they were sort of mentioned in this article at all?
No, I'm not familiar with that name, but I was going to bring up the village of Bronxville for something else that had to do with city, when you do the check of city, and you had a discussion about it, you know, how the city of Missoula is growing so much and it has to grow. That's not true. I mean, they can contain growth just like they did and still do in a village of 9,000 people, which is only about 15 miles from New York City, and they do contain it, believe me.
All right, Elena.
So I'll leave that with you.
All right.
Write a book about Bronx. Maybe I will.
Thanks for the call. You go right ahead. We'll read it. All right, so gentlemen, we have exactly 2 minutes left in our time together.
Real quickly, the next book for next month is Bob Bauer, Bauer, and the title is The Unraveling. And it's a book. Bob Bauer was White House counsel to Obama. He was Biden's personal attorney. But this is not about any of that. It's about a congressional election, perhaps the closest and most closely contested congressional election in American history back in 1984 in Indiana. And he, as a very young attorney, he was involved on the Democratic side. And it's an interesting book because he's still very clearly a partisan, but he makes the point that he thinks this is kind of the beginning of the hyper-partisanship that we've been talking about. And there are a lot of points you could point to, whether it's the Bork nomination or this, that, the other thing. But his point on this one is that the Democrats basically overturned in Congress, overturned an election and the state's determination of the outcome of an election. And his point was they did it because they had the majority and they could do it. And he looks back and he thinks, well, maybe we didn't handle that as well as we might have. But and again, I don't know whether he's right about it being the turning point. But it's an interesting idea, and we thought it would interest the viewers, the listeners.
Great. And Mehrdad, as always, thank you for your time. We appreciate it, sir. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Dr.
Thank
Meir.
you very much.
Appreciate
Thank you,
it.
and thank the callers.
You bet. And you guys, again, as always, make it a great show. All of our callers, we appreciate it. And by the way, coming up tomorrow, Nick will be back. Yay. And we'll have Dr. John Lott joining us here in the studio this morning. As you know, he's become internationally known, especially nationally, after some revelations that he made about a faulty FBI crime report. Anyway, so have yourselves a great day, everybody. We'll